She is my woman, and no one talks to her like that.
The main ballroom of the Imperial Hotel in Seoul pulsed with the calculated energy of a spectacle staged for the eyes of the elite. Beneath the glittering chandeliers, influential politicians, conglomerate heirs, and figures of Korean high society sat at lavishly decorated tables, exchanging greetings, toasts, and unspoken promises. At the center of that majestic setting, CEO Kang Dae-hyun carried on his shoulders not only the weight of the surname he represented, but the expectations of an entire empire that saw him as the perfect link between tradition and future. Beside him, Han Hye-jin, draped in a simple blue dress with a discreet gaze, tried to hide her unease behind a firm posture, though she knew deep down that the eyes around her were not seeking to know her, but to judge her, as if her presence in that place were a silent affront to the system those guests helped maintain. It was clear that, for many there, she represented a threat, not because of power or influence, but because she broke an unwritten rule, that people like her don't cross certain doors. And when the Kang family patriarch stood, with his imposing presence and judgmental gaze, everything indicated that a diplomatic speech would mark that moment. However, his words came like a sharp blade. He declared without hesitation that the union between his son and this young woman was a disgrace to the family line, publicly calling her a street girl, as if her origins were an irremovable stain. The impact was brutal, freezing the room in a deafening silence. As Hye-jin felt her dignity shatter before everyone, what no one yet knew was that this humiliation would mark the beginning of an utterly unexpected turn of events. Because what would happen in the next few moments would change not only the fate of a discredited woman, but would dismantle in front of the entire elite the castle of appearances built on pride, silence, and power. If this story has already touched you, stay with us and subscribe now so you don't miss what's next. Enjoy the video and get ready, because this is just the beginning. As the hall fell silent after Kang Jun-ho's cutting statement, every eye turned to Dae-hyun and Hye-jin, as if their entire story was about to be tried before hundreds of witnesses. But to grasp the depth of that night, one had to take a step back and see the true figures behind this drama. Han Hye-jin, at 26, bore the mark of resilience in her eyes. Orphaned at an early age, she grew up in Incheon under the care of her aunt, surviving between temporary jobs and nights dedicated to studying. Her determination earned her a scholarship to one of Seoul's most prestigious universities. But even there, she never felt fully accepted. Her expression bore the simplicity of someone who never sought status, but the strength of someone who learned to face closed doors without losing hope. Beside her was Kang Dae-hyun, heir to one of South Korea's most powerful conglomerates, the Kang Group. At 32, he was respected in business, feared by his rivals, and admired for his cool decision-making. His name was synonymous with prestige, and his presence was the subject of endless speculation in the newspapers. But behind his impeccable image and calculated gestures lay a man who had lost something essential: the ability to trust. Surrounded by people who desired him only for his power and wealth, Dae-hyun lived trapped in a world where true affection seemed unattainable. At the center of the pressure was Kang Jun-ho, the patriarch, a man of rigid demeanor, known for turning adversaries to dust with a single movement. His obsession with the family's image surpassed all limits. For him, every decision was a matter of honor and power, and accepting a daughter-in-law of humble origins was inconceivable. His voice, always charged with authority, echoed like law not only in the company, but also in his son's personal life. And among the shadows of the elite emerged Im Hye-ran, the socialite who had once been touted as Dae-hyun's ideal bride. Rich, influential, and willing to do anything to maintain her place among the most talked about names, she carried the flame of rivalry in her eyes. For her, seeing Hye-jin alongside the heir was not only an affront, but a personal defeat that needed to be reversed at any cost. With such powerful pieces on this board, it wasn't hard to predict that the night wouldn't end peacefully. Each character carried secrets, fears, and ambitions that would inevitably collide. And as the murmurs intensified in the room, the question no one dared to silence took shape. How could a young woman, marked by simplicity, face the weight of an empire that seemed determined to crush her? The glasses still clink softly in the trembling hands of some guests, as if echoing the weight of Kang Jun-ho's words. The luxurious room seemed to close in around Han Hye-jin, trapping her in a dome of contemptuous gazes. Every breath became an effort. Every second an eternity. The world around her had never given her room to dream, and now, at the height of the moment that should symbolize victory and love, she found herself exposed as a target of mockery and revulsion. The words "street girl" were not just an insult, but a sentence. They carried the weight of the social hierarchy that dictated who could and could not be part of the Korean elite. Hye-jin remembered her childhood in Incheon, the afternoons she would run through the narrow streets, the days she would help her aunt sell small sweets to earn a living. The past, which had always been a source of pride, was now transformed into a source of mockery before a crowd that judged her without knowing her history. Meanwhile, the murmurs grew louder. A lady, adorned with sparkling jewelry, leaned discreetly toward her friend and commented that the union was a sure mistake. A young businessman shook his head, muttering that Dae-hyun should never tarnish the family name with a woman so beneath him. The whispered words didn't reach Hye-jin's ears clearly, but the tone, the averted glances, and the muffled laughter were more eloquent than any speech. However, Kang Dae-hyun's silence was what cut her most to the core. Here was the man who, on so many nights, had promised her support, who had held her hand when she doubted herself, who had spoken to her about true love when everything seemed impossible. But at that moment, he remained silent, watching his father with an unreadable expression. Every second without a response was interpreted as indifference, and Hye-jin's heart pounded in despair. Jun-ho raised his glass again, as if the gesture alone were enough to settle the matter. His voice echoed firmly, full of authority, reaffirming that he would not accept a union that would shame the Kangs. The hall, silently complicit, seemed to agree with his judgment. Hye-jin lowered her gaze, feeling tears threaten to escape, but summoned the strength to stand up. Straight. If she had learned anything in life, it was that she should not let anyone see her breakdown. The next few moments became unbearable. The music had stopped, the laughter had faded, and only the weight of humiliation filled the air. Hye-jin wanted to disappear, but she knew that running away at that moment would be like surrendering victory to all those who wanted to see her defeated. Still, the pain was so intense that each second seemed to carve invisible scars into her soul. As the night wore on in tension, a question began to emerge among those present. If the heir didn't take a stand, not only would Hye-jin be destroyed, but his image would also be forever tarnished. After all, silence could be interpreted as cowardice, and in a world where power and honor walked hand in hand, there was no room for indecision. And it was precisely in this void of words and gestures that eyes turned once more to Dae-hyun. His impenetrable expression hid thoughts no one dared decipher. Was he about to give in to his father, abandoning the woman he had chosen to love? Or did that silence carry something much deeper, a calculated move that would change the course of the night? The hall remained suspended in an almost unbearable silence, as if every breath were tied to the decision of a single man. Kang Dae-hyun remained motionless, his eyes fixed on his father, but his mind wandered in ways no one could follow. He was not just a son before the patriarch, he was an heir before an empire, and at the same time, a man before the woman he had learned to love unreservedly. The tension hanging over his shoulders seemed overwhelming, and yet he remained serene, observing every detail, every look, every gesture around him. The guests stared at him expectantly, waiting for a word, a movement, any sign that he would take a stand. For many, the prolonged silence was a harbinger of surrender. The elite, accustomed to seeing him as a figure of absolute control, interpreted the pause as the hesitation of a man torn between duty and passion, and at that moment, the whispers were already turning into speculation that cut the air like blades. Hye-jin, beside him, felt her heartbeat erratically. The seconds stretched like hours, and the weight of the silence was as brutal as the humiliating words she'd just heard. She tried to search Dae-hyun's eyes for a spark of response, a sign that she wasn't alone, but all she found was an impenetrable mask. It was as if he'd erected an invisible wall, and behind it hid something even she couldn't grasp. The patriarch, in turn, interpreted his son's lack of reaction as submission. A slight smile of triumph appeared on his lips, convinced that his authority remained intact, that once again his son would bow to the force of his power. Jun-ho lifted his chin, savoring the silence as if it were definitive proof of his victory. But there was something in Dae-hyun's eyes that few noticed. Behind the stillness lay a contained flame, a meticulous calculation that prepared for the right moment. He wasn't a man to react impulsively, and his silence wasn't a sign of weakness, but of preparation. He observed each guest, recorded every murmur, as if planning not just a response, but a statement that would echo far beyond the night. And it was in this invisible game of looks, humiliations, and expectations that the question began to form in everyone's hearts. When the silence was broken, would it be to confirm defeat or to set the room on fire with an unexpected turn of events? The silence that hung over the hall, so dense and suffocating, seemed to trap everyone in a limbo of expectations. But to understand the weight that moment carried, it was necessary to go back in time, to a rainy night in Gangnam, where fate had forged an unlikely encounter between two worlds that should never have crossed. That night, the streets were drenched, neon lights reflected in puddles, and cars sped by, spraying droplets that scattered. Like small explosions, the icy wind bit at the skin, forcing passers-by to shelter under hurried umbrellas. Inside a small corner cafe, hidden among modern buildings and luxurious storefronts, Han Hye-jin, he wiped the tables with a worn cloth, trying to maintain a welcoming atmosphere. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the space, mixed with the soft sound of rain beating against the windows. Hye-jin worked late almost every day, balancing long shifts with studying. Regulars knew her for her discreet smile and her careful memory of everyone's favorite orders. But that night, an unexpected customer walked through the door, bringing with them not only the rain clinging to their coat, but also an aura that completely changed the atmosphere of the place. CEO Kang Dae-hyun, wearing a dark overcoat that emphasized his imposing posture. His serious gaze, accustomed to being greeted with reverence, met only Hye-jin's serene neutrality. She didn't recognize him immediately, and this surprised him. Accustomed to being surrounded by sycophants, that simple "good evening, what would you like" felt like a breath of fresh air. He ordered just a black coffee, and while he waited, he watched her attentively, wiping down tables, arranging chairs, and clearing dishes with an almost artistic delicacy. There was a naturalness about her that contrasted with the artificial world of appearances he was immersed in. As she handed him the steaming cup, Hye-jin smiled genuinely, without any hidden interest, And it was at that moment that something awakened in Dae-hyun. From that night on, the visits became frequent. Always at the same time, always in the same place, as if the coffee shop had become a secret refuge for him. Over time, the barrier of silence broke. They talked about small details of life, about old movies, about songs they both listened to in the cold early mornings. He, accustomed to dealing with business strategies and million-dollar decisions, found himself talking about childhood memories. She, accustomed to being invisible, was surprised that someone would listen to her stories with such attention. A striking scene remained. On an even colder night, when the rain seemed relentless, the coffee shop was nearly empty. Hye-jin, exhausted, let out a heavy sigh. Dae-hyun, noticing, asked if she was okay. She replied with a shy smile that she was just tired, but that she had to keep going because she had no other choice. He looked at her silently, and, in that moment, he understood that there was a strength within her far greater than any wealth could offer. It was in this contrast of worlds that something inexplicable was born. There were no contracts, strategic alliances, or political interests. There were simply two hearts finding in each other what the entire world seemed to deny. To Han Hye-jin, Dae-hyun was just a lonely man seeking refuge between plain walls and a hot cup of coffee. To Dae-hyun, Han Hye-jin was proof that purity still existed, in a universe tainted by ambition and masks. And yet, that secret love already carried within it the seed of conflict. He knew he would never be accepted by his father. She knew she would never be seen as worthy by the elite. But back then, neither of them cared. What mattered were the laughs exchanged at the end of the workday, the knowing glances in the rain, the short walks to the bus stop, when the cold seemed less cruel because they walked side by side. And it was precisely this memory, held in both their hearts, that made the humiliation at dinner all the more painful, because beneath the cruel accusations and the scornful looks, there lay a true story that no one knew. A story that began in a forgotten coffee shop, but was now being tested under the weight of an empire. And while everyone waited for the outcome in the luxurious hall, a silent doubt echoed. Would that love born under the rain have enough strength to survive the approaching storm? The memories of their first encounters in that Gangnam coffee shop, which at first seemed banal and unpretentious, ultimately proved to be the foundation of a feeling that grew silently, but with an almost indomitable force. For Han Hye-jin, it wasn't the presence of the heir to a billion-dollar conglomerate that enchanted her, but the way Dae-hyun let his social masks fall whenever they were alone, revealing himself as a real human man, marked by uncertainties, fatigue, and pain that didn't fit into newspapers or boardrooms. For him, every moment with that young woman was like a breath of freedom in a world where everything was surveillance, pressure, and suffocating expectation. The love that grew between them wasn't fueled by extravagance, but by simple, genuine gestures, like the silent walks along the banks of the Han River on cold nights, when the icy wind became an excuse to draw closer and share warmth. On those nights, under the reflected city lights, Han Hye-jin spoke sweetly of their shared dreams. To finish her studies, to help the aunt who had raised her with effort and dignity, to have a peaceful life. Dae-hyun listened with a look of surprise and delight, for in that world where everything was self-interest, hearing someone speak of the future with such honesty was like touching a forgotten truth. As their love took root, external barriers also grew. Dae-hyun's father, suspicious of his son's absences, began quiet investigations. Friends warned him that such involvement threatened the family's image. Hye-jin, the target of stares and whispers at university, was accused of opportunism. Still, they both remained steadfast, and it was in a snow-covered park, amidst childish games and an unexpected embrace, that Dae-hyun whispered a sincere promise. No matter what came, he would not give her up. This memory, so intimate and true, would be what ignite the courage he had yet to awaken. The love between Han Hye-jin and Kang Dae-hyun blossomed in silence. But silence is rarely eternal in a world where power dictates the rules and envy seeps into the cracks of other people's happiness. With each encounter, with each smile exchanged, a shadow loomed around them, as if fate were preparing a minefield that would soon explode beneath their feet. This shadow had a name and a face. Hye-ran, the socialite that the entire society had already imagined as the future wife of the Kang heir. Hye-ran was known not only for her striking beauty and skill at manipulating appearances, but also for the influence she had cultivated among politicians, business people, and journalists. She had grown accustomed to getting whatever she wanted and never accepted defeat as an outcome. When she learned through discreet rumors that Dae-hyun was spending time with a young woman of modest origin, her disbelief turned to fury. For her, it wasn't just a matter of love, it was a matter of territory. And her territory would not be invaded by someone who didn't even know the rules of the game. With carefully calculated words, Hye-ran began spreading rumors at parties and gatherings. She whispered that Hye-jin had approached Dae-hyun out of self-interest, that she used her innocence as a mask to acquire her fortune, that her simplicity was merely a disguise for cold ambition. The whispers, strategically dropped in the right circles, spread like wildfire. Soon, the elite were repeating the stories as unquestionable truths. Kang Jun-ho didn't need much to believe it. Always suspicious of anyone who approached his family, he saw the rumors as confirmation of his suspicions. To him, Hye-jin was nothing more than a threat, someone who could tarnish decades of building prestige. Fueled by Hye-ran's venomous words, his contempt for the young woman grew to the point where the dinner party became a battlefield. Hye-jin, oblivious to the intensity of the intrigue, noticed only the increasingly hostile looks she received whenever she frequented certain spaces with Dae-hyun. What had once been discreet whispers now turned into muffled laughter and vicious words hurled her way. Still, she held firm, believing that the love she had built would be enough to weather any storm. Dae-hyun, on the other hand, noticed the web of intrigue tightening around them. He knew Hye-ran wouldn't give up easily and that his father was willing to do anything to separate the couple. But as always, he kept his thoughts to himself, carefully planning when and how he would face the inevitable confrontation. And it was precisely this web of conspiracies, fueled by envy and prejudice, that culminated in the fateful night in the hall of Hotel Imperial. As bowls gleamed and orchids perfumed the air, an invisible atmosphere of judgment had already been prepared. The humiliation that would befall Hye-jin would not be the result of chance, but of a carefully woven plot by those who could not bear to see the impossible become reality. However, what no one could have predicted was that under the unbearable pressure, something much greater could be born. And the question that remained was, how far would Hye-ran and Jun-ho himself be willing to go to destroy this love before it fully blossomed? The main hall of the Hotel Imperial was imbued with an atmosphere that blended luxury and venom. The tables, adorned with impeccable arrangements of white orchids, seemed to conceal the tension building in the air. Each guest, dressed in dazzling attire, eagerly awaited the patriarch's speech, but behind the formal smiles lay an anxiety no one dared admit. The dinner, which was supposed to symbolize the union of two lives, had already transformed into a stage for judgment, and everyone there knew something grand was about to happen. Kang Jun-ho stood up slowly, with the studied calm of someone who knew his every move would be watched. His eyes roamed the room, lingering for long seconds on Hye-jin, as if to expose her fragility to everyone. He raised his crystal. A glass, but his voice, instead of blessing, carried the weight of condemnation. "Today we are gathered to celebrate. But I must be honest," he said gravely, letting a heavy silence descend. "As patriarch of this family, I cannot accept a union that tarnishes our lineage." The guests held their breath. Some looked at each other, surprised by Junho's boldness, while others simply lowered their heads, fearing they would be seen as complicit in any disagreement. "This woman," he continued, discreetly pointing at Hye-jin, "is not worthy of carrying the Kang name. She grew up without lineage, without standing, without value to society. She's just a street urchin who dared to dream too big." The words, sharp as blades, cut through the air. Hye-jin felt an unbearable heat rise to her face, tears welling up in her eyes, but she fought them back. The entire hall seemed to be watching her with contempt, and every whisper that arose among the guests sounded like a sentence against her. He ran at one of the nearest tables, barely managed to hide her triumphant smile. The scene was exactly what she had hoped for, Hye-jin being crushed before the elite, with no room for defense. All around, glances multiplied, some of mockery, some of false compassion, but all driven by the cruel curiosity of witnessing the downfall of the young woman who had dared to defy convention. Dae-hyun remained silent. His impenetrable expression confused everyone. Was he giving in to his father's will, or preparing for something unexpected? This prolonged silence, however, only deepened Hye-jin's humiliation. Her heart screamed for a word of defense, for a gesture of support, but the weight of his absence made her feel even more alone. The whispers exploded in increasingly intense waves. A woman commented that the union was a scandal. A young man chuckled softly, saying that the heir had lost his mind. The sound of the words echoed like hammer blows in Hye-jin's chest, each comment reinforcing her feeling of not belonging. For a moment, she considered getting up and leaving, fleeing the place and ending this torment once and for all. But her legs felt rooted to the spot, and her remaining pride compelled her to resist, even if only in silence. Junho, realizing the impact of his words, raised his glass one last time, as if to end any possibility of reply. "If my son insists on this union, be it known, he will no longer be recognized as my heir." The hall fell into absolute silence. The last words echoed like thunder, leaving everyone stunned. The future of the Kang Empire was at stake, and the tension now fell not just on Hye-jin, but on Dae-hyun as well. And in that moment when everyone was waiting for the heir's reaction, the question hung in the air like a flame ready to set everything on fire. Would he bow before his father, or would he have the courage to defy an empire in the name of love? The weight of silence following Kang Junho's words seemed to suffocate every corner of that imposing hall, as if the air had become too thick to breathe. None of the guests dared move a muscle, as if the mere act of existing in the face of that sentence were an affront. Han Hye-jin, her eyes fixed on the polished marble floor, fought back the tears that threatened to escape, trying to maintain some dignity in a scenario where every gaze pierced her with judgment. It was as if her entire being were exposed, defenseless, before an audience awaiting only one reaction, that of the heir. Dae-hyun remained seated, motionless, carrying on his shoulders a pressure that for years had shaped him to obey, to represent, to never confront. His father, still standing, held his gaze with the haughtiness of someone certain his word remained law. Everything indicated that once again silence would prevail, that he would remain silent, complicit, molded. But something inside him had snapped. The sound of the chair scraping against the floor shook the room. Dae-hyun stood slowly, each gesture demonstrating control, but his expression made it clear that his decision was born of conviction, not fear. He took Hye-jin's hand firmly and stood beside her, not as someone protecting out of obligation, but as someone who chooses to be by the side of the one he loves, even under judgment. And it was then, with a firm, penetrating voice, that he uttered words that would echo far beyond that night. He called his father arrogant for measuring love with status and wealth, and declared before everyone that Hye-jin was his wife, not of convenience, but of true love. And in that moment, without shouting, he shattered the empire of fear with a single sentence. Today, before all of you, I declare that she is my wife. Dae-hyun's words were still echoing through the hall when the heavy, uncomfortable silence fell again. But this time, it wasn't the silence of fear or submission. It was the silence of disbelief, of the collective sense that something historic had just happened. Kang, Jun-ho's authority, built over decades of unquestioned power, had been shaken in front of hundreds of witnesses. The patriarch, accustomed to controlling every detail of his family and business, felt his throat dry. His eyes, once filled with arrogance, now reflected restrained fury and wounded pride. He hadn't expected to be confronted, much less in public, and so he hadn't prepared a response. Every second of hesitation heightened the realization that his previously untouchable status could indeed be challenged. The attentive guests watched the scene with a mixture of fascination and awe. Some, especially the younger ones, admired Dae-hyun's courage and even applauded silently, discreetly hiding their expressions of support. Others, longtime allies of Jun-ho, murmured among themselves, worried about the impact this rupture could have on the company's future and political alliances. It was as if the patriarch's symbolic downfall had opened a rift whose depth no one dared predict. Hye-ran, until then certain that Hye-jin would be destroyed, now found herself grounded. Her eyes trembled between anger and despair. What she had so carefully planned, turning the evening into a humiliating defeat for her rival, had become an even greater victory for the woman she despised most. Hye-jin, for her part, could hardly believe what she had just witnessed. She still felt the weight of the cruel words that had wounded her minutes before, but now there was also the unshakable force of Dae-hyun's public declaration. He hadn't just defended her. He had sealed before everyone that he was willing to lose everything to keep her by his side. And this certainty filled her with courage, even though the fear of retaliation remained lurking. Jun-ho, his chin held high and his eyes flashing, took a deep breath and tried to maintain his unshakable posture. But those present had already seen the crack. No matter how much he tried to regain his dignity with his imposing bearing, everyone knew something had changed forever that night. Patriarch Kang's image of absolute power was damaged, and from that moment on, a silent war began, whose outcome no one could predict. And it was impossible not to wonder, what would Jun-ho do to regain the power that had escaped him before everyone's eyes? The weight of the night seemed to concentrate around just two figures, Kang Dae-hyun and Han Hye-jin. After facing his own father before the elite, the heir knew he had crossed a line from which he could not return. And yet there was no hesitation in his eyes, only the firmness of someone who, for the first time, had chosen to live according to his heart. Hye-jin, beside him, trembled. It wasn't just from the impact of Jun-ho's words or the hostile gazes surrounding her, but from the fear that she was dragging Dae-hyun down an irreversible path. Her heart was torn between the joy of being defended so powerfully and the fear that he would be punished for a choice that seemed too bold to bear. With tears in her eyes, she held his hand tightly and whispered, barely audible, "I'm sorry. Are you ready to lose everything because of me?" Dae-hyun stared at her in silence for a moment, as if trying to forever capture the image of that woman who, even though fragile, still had the courage to doubt. Then he leaned closer and answered, without looking away, "I'm not missing anything, Hye-jin. Everything I really needed, I've already found in you." The words, spoken firmly, yet tenderly, spread through the hall like a flame. The surprised guests murmured in shock. Some expressions softened, others hardened, but no one could remain indifferent to the scene. The heir to the Kang Empire was, indeed, willing to risk his legacy for a woman everyone there considered unworthy. Junho sat there, watching with a petrified expression. His son's every gesture seemed an open challenge, a direct affront to his authority. But the more he tried to maintain his image of power, the more evident his defeat in the face of Dae-hyun's courage became. And it was, at that moment, amidst the tense silence, that the heir leaned forward and, in front of everyone, sealed his words with a kiss on Hye-jin. It wasn't just a gesture of love. It was a definitive declaration that nothing, not even the weight of an empire, would be enough to separate them. The hall erupted in comments, some reproachful, others hushed with admiration. There, amidst timid applause and disapproving glances, it was clear that the decision had been made. Their love was no longer a secret, hidden in discreet coffee shops or nighttime walks along the Han River. It was a forbidden, challenging, but above all, irrevocable love. The days that followed dinner at Hotel Imperial turned into a whirlwind that swept across South Korea. Newspapers splashed headlines on the Kang family scandal, highlighting the public humiliation and, above all, Dae-hyun's unexpected declaration in defense of Han Hye-jin. Social media was abuzz, dividing opinions between those who considered the act a gesture of true love and those who saw it as a reckless act capable of shaking the stability of an empire. But for the couple, none of that mattered as much as the certainty that they had made the right decision. Hye-jin still felt the weight of the exposure, but she discovered a strength she never imagined she possessed. With every veiled attack, every snide comment, she found in Dae-hyun's eyes the support she needed to stand tall, and the more they tried to belittle her, the more she remembered why she had fallen in love. He didn't need masks to be by her side, just the truth they had shared since their first meeting. Dae-hyun, for his part, was aware that his choice would not go unpunished. Company advisors, political allies, and even distant family members sought him out, seeking explanations, trying to convince him to back down. But with each conversation, his resolve became even more unshakable. For the first time in years, he felt free, his own man, guided not by the will of the patriarch, but by the strength of a feeling no calculation could have predicted. Amidst the turmoil, the two sought refuge where it all began, on the tranquil banks of the Han River. They walked together, hand in hand, ignoring the curious glances of those who recognized them. The wind blew gently, as if trying to wash away their fresh wounds, and the city lights reflected on the water, creating a landscape that seemed to confirm that despite the chaos, there was still beauty in the path they had chosen. It was there, under the Seoul night sky, that Dae-hyun stopped, held Hye-jin's hands tightly and said, "No matter what the future holds, no matter how much they try to separate us, from today on, I want you to be certain of one thing. There is no wealth, inheritance, or power that compares to the value of having you by my side." The words, simple yet emotionally charged, made Hye-jin shed tears she could no longer contain. She hugged him tightly, as if holding not just a man, but the promise of a life built on truth and courage. And as the two stood there, entwined in an embrace that defied the entire world, it was clear that their story would never be forgotten. The dinner that began with humiliation had ended as a symbol of redemption. The groom's father, who believed he had crushed the young woman before the elite, had ended up witnessing the strength of a love that bowed to no empire. The final image, marked by the brightness of the lights reflected in the Han River and the certainty that emanated from his eyes, left an echo in the hearts of all who followed that story. Sometimes, True power lies not in the inheritance one receives, but in the courage to choose who one loves, even when the whole world says one shouldn't. And it is with this truth, as powerful as fate itself, that the story reaches its conclusion. But for those of you who have followed every detail of this moving romance, here's a special invitation. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, leave your like and share it with someone who also needs to believe that true love is capable of defying any barrier.